Hello, I'm Harvey Mansfield, and this is the program on constitutional government, which is connected to the Great Green Government Department at Harvard. And our guest today is Wesley Yang. Wesley Yang is described as an American essayist. He's a commentator, he's a podcaster, and he writes blogs at Substack and publishes articles in many publications, including Tablet. He's the author of The Soul of Yellow Folk, which came out in 2018. And he was born to Korean American parents, went to Rutgers. That's unspecific, but let it stand. His parents came over as a consequence of the Korean War, and he was born here, and he's taken up two topics, it seems, in his writings and speaking. And the first is about Asian Americans and their special or peculiar place in the spectrum of American diversity. And the second is what he calls a successor ideology, which he's going to talk about today. And he's being Asian or Korean, he's shown that he doesn't have the usual Asian boring, studious personality, which causes so much comment. But he has also commented on that kind of comment, which is saying that to say that he's not one of those, namely like other Asians. And then he writes and speaks without indignation. He seems to be able to discuss the latest outrage without being so outraged. And he excels at bringing out the larger significance of things, and that's, I think, resulted in what he calls a successor ideology, which has, I suppose, some relationship to American liberalism. So I don't know whether you've been at Harvard before. Perhaps I hope you haven't, because our motto is we invite people who otherwise wouldn't be invited. But even if so, welcome to Harvard, or to a subversive small subgroup of Harvard. And here's Wesley Yang.
Thanks so much. And so why successor ideology? This is the question. Why do we need a term at all? Why do we need this term? Why does this term make any sense or have any utility? First of all, the term is something that was spontaneously generated by me on the fly in the course of Twitter conversation. And only after having manifested the term in the midst of, did it occur to me, and you can see it happening on Twitter in the midst of a reply, that, oh, perhaps this will be a term that I will adopt and that others may adopt as well. There is a question about whether anyone is going to adopt it. It's appeared in a Ross Douthat column. Ross Douthat thereby at that moment repaying me for some of the previous, for some of the prior columns that he had taken from my Twitter musings and turned into subject matter for his own column, and putting on the map a term that, in my view, does serve a certain purpose. At the moment, it is poised partway between being a kind of private jargon shared between myself, my Twitter followers, and those who subscribe to my Substack, and something that actually exists in the world. There is now a Wikipedia entry on it, which I did not myself write. And of course, the term is in some sense a redundancy because all ideologies are in some meaningful sense a successor ideology. Marxism was a successor ideology claiming to realized the unfulfilled promises of liberalism, which liberalism could not, in fact, fulfill on its own. And I see the successor ideology as a successor ideology in that sense. It is a set of beliefs, psychological, cultural, moral, and political premises, new psychological, moral, and political premises that promise to fulfill the unrealized potential of liberalism. In the case of Marxism, the unrealized potential was, of course, the promise of equality, and yet the reality of drastic material inequality. And I think that you could think of the successor ideology as in the wake of the failure of a movement that claimed to be at the vanguard of history and that claimed to bring about the final reconciliation of all contradictions of bourgeois society, which was Marxism. In the wake of that failure, we move on now to the remaining gap between the promise of equality as codified within liberalism and the reality of drastic inequality in status, in self-esteem, in in other measurable outcomes on the one hand, but also in certain intangible qualities of respect. And so one way to think of the successor ideology is as a kind of because Marx always said that the revolution would happen in the fully industrialized state, right? And of course, the history of the 20th century, this is not how things went about. It ended up being the instrument of a very violent modernization of pre-modern states. But now we face a society at the end of history. And when I invoke the end of history, I speak of the term that Fukuyama ended up using it in the interview that I had with him in 2014, where he retreated, but I think rightly retreated to the position that the end of history only means that there's not a next stage. It means that there's nothing beyond. And it doesn't mean that we're going to stay within the end of history, and it doesn't mean it doesn't mean that there won't be reversion back to some prior state on the basis of continuing contradictions and tendencies. And in fact, this was all something that he talked about in the final chapter of his book by that name, in which he said that, amidst the terminal boredom at the end of history, there will still be inequalities between men, and those inequalities will serve, despite the fact that we have attained the final political manifestation of the quest for recognition, and that there's a certain political equilibrium that you can reach, a kind of zero-sum equilibrium where it is not possible for somebody to gain in status without another person losing in status. And so I think of the successor ideology as a way of dealing with that condition. There are still inequalities in abilities, there's still inequalities, and there are also still inequalities in status. And of course, even though they are not officially recognized, there are still ways in which there are illegitimate inequalities that are legacies left over from prior ages of inequality, race, gender, and so on and so forth. And so Fukuyama talks in his very first essay, he talks about a nostalgia that he feels for the desire for there to be a movement of history, because movements of history bring out the best in us. They bring out our capacity for courage, our capacity for self-sacrifice. And he counterposed that to the endless tending of the Museum of History and the reduction of politics to mere technocratic, management of discrete individual problems of economic growth and so forth, and the need for there to be, and the desire that exists within him and within all of us, for there to be a great crusade. And so my argument about the successor ideology is that there are a series of new social movements in the 1960s that emancipated women, that sort of altered our, expanded the range of what was to be considered as normative within the realm of sexuality. And in the process of these activist energies being institutionalized, brought first into the universities, but then, sort of extending their sway into schools of social work and education, we created a professionalized cohort committed to and dependent for their employment upon the existence of the continued existence of great moral crusades in order to satisfy a demand that exists within us and within our society, within a society that is sort of sated materially, but that is spiritually impoverished. And we actually, and so there's this recurring, there's a book called the Abolitionist Imagination by the scholar Andrew Delbanco, where he writes about a recurring tendency throughout American history, of which, of course, the movement against slavery was the paradigm case, where there would be a great moral emergency that is at our door that must be eradicated at any cost. And of course, posterity, of which we are a part, all shares in the judgment that the abolitionists who fought slavery were in fact facing a great moral emergency that had to be eradicated at any cost. In the case of American history, that took the form of the 19th century's bloodiest war and the sundering of the nation and its reconstruction, all through tremendous tremendous violence. The question today, though, is we've now created a kind of cohort of those who derive their livings on the basis of more great moral emergencies that have to be eradicated at any cost. And what this class of people has done is elaborated a new set of great moral emergencies, not the existence of humans owning other humans, but the existence of differential outcomes on standardized tests, the existence of standardized tests as such, the existence of meritocratic criteria being used to judge those to judge and to evaluate and choose those who would participate in certain occupations. Also, the existence of a binary a gender structure. Another great moral emergency that has to be eradicated, the existence of a thing called whiteness, which has come to stand in for a totalizing system of oppression in which the very foundations of language through which we articulate and understand ourselves and elaborate the relationship between self and other, and between knowing, truth, and power being irredeemably polluted by a set of standards that harms non-white people and elevates white people. So we have whiteness, we have masculinity, we have a binary structure of the genders, we have the existence of tests, we have the existence of police, we have the existence of prisons. And so what this all leads to is an ideology that calls for, on the one hand, a radically less disciplinary society of the street, where disparities in incarceration and policing move us toward or impel us toward totalizing solutions in the direction of police abolition, or at least defunding. On the other hand, a radically more police society of the classroom, bedroom, boardroom, because the real evils that we have to be concerned about in society are those hidden in those places that were once conceived of as the sort of fonts of our normative values and of normality. So, there was an essay written, I think, in the early '90s by Charles Krautheimer, called Defining Deviancy Up, where he made reference to the Daniel Patrick Moynihan essay called Defining Deviance Down, which pointed to, which chronicled the fact that, the social problems of previous decades had been superseded by serious criminality and exploding rates of mental illness, and there was an imperative, sort of within right-thinking discourse to normalize these conditions as an ordinary part of life. But he also pointed out a concurrent move, in this project of moral leveling, to say that all of the things that had once been thought of as normative were in fact the real places where evil existed in our society, and had to be rooted out. And so the home began to be seen as the site of, of sexual predation and of domestic violence. And the two, the sort of the nuclear family began to be seen as the place, the seat where dangerous patriarchal attitudes that undergird rape culture was present. And he was making this argument at a very early stage of this development in the early 90s. And these culture wars that were present at the time and that were a big part of the university, because anybody who was at the university back then is familiar with, arguments about the non-existence of a gender binary, about the sort of oppressive, omnipresence of white standards of conduct and intellectual behavior that masqueraded as, neutral standards of scholarship or reason, pretended to be universal, but in fact were merely masks for the unequal power of a group of white men. And what we've seen since then is a dual movement where there's been a continual elaboration of these critiques. And then, of course, the seizure of these critiques of institutional power and the building out over the decades, within activist-oriented departments that were, for a long time, for many decades, seen as a kind of sop to activists, as derided as merely grievance studies, not seen as intellectually respectable. Sort of Robin DiAngelo is a person who comes from one of these departments. I think it's a second or third tier state college in a red state, and Tima Okun, who's the kind of who wrote what I call the copy pasta, saying that white supremacy culture is individualism, objectivity, which is often presented as this kind of ironic document that racists must have created, but that is in fact being rolled out at corporations and educational trainings throughout the country. Tima Okun has a degree, I think, from Oberlin in physical education, and no further education. And so, there's this process where you have these departments that were created through activism and that were seen as a kind of cordon sanitaire where you could keep these people employed and they would not, they would not destroy the ordinary workings of scholarship. But then something happened, right? In the mid 2010s, I think, right? So some of these ideas sort of broke the blood-brain barrier, via social media and especially by Tumblr. And a group of young people who were sort of inculcated themselves into these ideas, and they showed up around 2013 or 2014 in universities, and they transformed every institution that they touched. And this was the period when it would be common to hear people say, it's a handful of college students, which is true. I mean, it was not true in the year 2013, 2014, that more than 5 to 10% of the students were really passionate about these ideas. But we saw in action, Nassim Taleb wrote about the power of the intolerant minority, and so the example that he used was, I think, all juices are kosher, or something to this extent, and because a small minority, it became sort of marginally easier to accommodate a small minority. But by making it the standard for everyone else, if there was not a larger majority that was similarly activated, similarly, strong in their belief on behalf of the contrary principles. And we saw this dynamic happening in 2010, where there were these things that everybody believed, in the same way that one believed one should wear clothes before one goes outside. If there were movements, for sort of voluntary or compulsory nudism, the arguments that were made on behalf of have our ability to make those arguments has fallen into abeyance. We simply feel that this is a settled question, as we felt, existing within the sort of free speech regime that obtained, between the years, between the settlement, the post-McCarthyite settlement, right? Because in order to arrive at the free speech settlement, it was necessary to cancel the communists, who would have canceled those who canceled them if they were not themselves canceled, right? And on the basis of that, there was a new regime and a new establishment where one could be a Harvey Weinstein in a department, or Harvey Mansfield, I'm sorry, in a department with communists, and the communists and Harvey Mansfield knew how to interact with one another, right? Even if and that thing ended really fast, and it died before anyone was really able to mount a defense, in part because there was an attacker's advantage on behalf of those who were full of passionate, right? The Yeats term, they were full of passionate energy, and they were facing those who took for granted that one could simply say, oh, you make your stock arguments on behalf of free speech, and that would be the end of it. And it turned out to be the case that those stock arguments no longer obtained. And it turned out to be the case that when you look back at the history of things, of course, like our consensus around free speech, of which a person like Noam Chomsky is a part, right? Because he was a communist who existed by sufferance of the prior free speech regime, right? Like in a setting that was far more conservative. And so he's still one of these guys that makes these pro-speech, free speech comments. And recently, Dissent magazine had a symposium on this subject, and the people who spoke on behalf of the old free speech ideals, the lefties who did that, Katha Pollitt, and so on, were the members of the Dissent staff who are over the age of 70, and those who are under the age of 40, all took the opposite position. So free speech is just one part of an overall new set of values. And for a long time, people didn't recognize that these just weren't sort of people who were ill-informed about liberal values. These were people who were adhering to an entirely different creed. And, the entirely different creed sort of, was borne in upon me, when I went to a student-run cafe at Concordia University. I live in Montreal, and there's a campus there, and there's a sign on the wall. I'm going to read it to you. I just did a Substack post about it, and it begins with it was put there by student life bureaucrats, and the sign says the following. It says, respect everyone's physical and emotional boundaries. It says, don't assume anyone's gender identity, background, sexual preferences, health, etc. respect everyone's beliefs, opinions, experiences, and points of view, be responsible for your actions, be aware that your actions affect others despite what your intentions might be. And then at the bottom, the really amazing thing, okay, help us keep racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, cultural appropriation, trans misogyny, classism, colorism, fat phobia, Islamophobia, misogynoir, ableism, and oppressive behavior / attitudes out of this space. Now, this space was a student-run cafe. And it said, feeling uncomfortable, want to talk? Speak to someone on the kitchen staff, right? And so it's like, what is the kitchen staff going to do? What is the competence of the kitchen staff for somebody who has experienced trans misogyny, right? And another sort of like notable thing about this is the precedence on the list of trans misogyny before misogyny and of transphobia before homophobia. And so this indicated, and you know, I saw this in 2016 and I posted it on Twitter, and I was like, how common are these, right, are these kinds of utterances on college campuses? And it turns out that these are everywhere. It turns out that it's led by student life administrators. It turns out that it is an ideology that is pretty much manufactured by student life administrators, but that it has embedded itself within the moral, emotional, and psychological baseline of a certain segment, and all of the antecedent assumptions that lie behind this, right? That spaces can be free of these things, that spaces must be free of these things, that these things are everywhere. And of course, they have all been defined such that they are everywhere. So there's a great essay by Henry Gates Jr. about critical race theory, where he talks about the critical race theory as kind of being premised upon a new moral mandate for political power and the creation of a therapeutic state. So, the state used to be there to ensure your rights, right? And to protect your ability to own property, to transact in the market, and to speak freely, and so on, and to own a gun, so on and so forth. Now there's a new mandate for constituted power, from which it derives its legitimacy, and for which it is responsible, which is to ensure that the dignity of every individual is respected at all times. And sort of Gates points out that this is not actually a construction of the rights of the states that is consistent with human freedom, right? This actually calls for this actually calls for a degree of policing that is rightly totalitarian. And so I think of the successor ideology as the working out and the manifestation of that aspiration as it takes institutional form. And we don't have a word for what I just said to you, right? We don't have a word for the project of keeping out racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, cultural appropriation, transmisogyny, misogyny, classism, colorism, fat phobia, Islamophobia, misogynoir, and oppressive behavior / attitudes out of a space. That's a whole new aspiration. It's different than the Marxist revolution. It's different than it's different than, and it's distinct from it's different from any kind of socialism that's out there. It's a kind of Trotskyism of the soul, right? And then it's taking and then embedded within a group of people who create the demand for further regulation. And so this is the dialectic between student activism and because when you read the list of demands during the season of protests that was launched back in 2015 and 2016, the demands would always be, more cultural resources, more student centers, more, culturally responsive therapists, more, student life coordinators, more faculty. The demand is always the expansion of our presence on campus, and the instrument through which this is used is essentially holding oneself hostage, holding a gun to one's own head. And this is why the trans person is so important, because a trans person is someone who can be affirmed or annulled through an act of speech, whose existence can be affirmed or annulled through an act of speech. And so the refusal to use that act of speech can be equated with genocide. And so if we proceed from the assumption that gender identity is an internal subjective feeling, and we proceed from the assumption that the denial of someone's internal subjective feeling is the denial of their personhood, and if we proceed from the assumption that the denial of someone's personhood is an act of violence against them, then it's perfectly logical that fettering the speech of someone who is engaged in an act of violence against the whole category of person is an act of fighting genocide. And the important thing to recognize is that what sounds to us like verbal, emotional, and psychological incontinence is in fact some people working out the inner logic of a new value system. And a new value system that doesn't just depart from liberalism, but that uses that appropriates some of the language of liberalism and some of its aspirations to equality, and that says that in order to actually attain these aspirations, in much the same way that Marxism says, in order to attain equality, in fact, that liberalism promised you, we have to overthrow and overturn liberalism. We must overthrow and overturn liberalism. We must fetter people's speech. We must ensure that they comply with the required words. Now, how did this archipelago of power come into existence? It came into existence because of it's a dialectical process, right? We had civil rights laws, right? Whose purpose was to dismantle Jim Crow. And then we had other laws whose purpose was to attain integration. But integration ended up being psychologically arduous, for those who, and destructive to the dignity of those who were thus being integrated. And so it turns out to be the case that, when you do polls of Black people, college-educated Black people are much more likely to say that they're victims of racism than non-college-educated Black people. And the reason of this, of course, is that the higher you move up in society, the more racially isolated you become, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the more subject you become to this thing called microaggression, right? And of course, Henry Layers Jr. wrote his essay in a period before the term microaggression was in wide circulation, but he did point out at the time this relentless dynamic by which there would always be a way to reconstrue and reconvene the question of a racial disadvantage, as owing to a form of racism, and so we have this dual movement where we have these new disciplinary, these new regulatory structures in place in response to newly generated and manifested moral emergencies that are in case. One of the moral emergencies being the ongoing transgender genocide. Another moral emergency being, the ongoing crisis of microaggression. And it took institutional form in 2011 when there was announcement of a rape crisis on college campuses, at a time when sort of the uniform crime reporting showed that the number of rapes happening in America had decreased by 85%, right, between the years 1980 and 2019. So at the very moment where a problem, right, has become drastically reduced in its extent, we had the president, we had the vice president, we had sort of announcing the existence of the crisis, and then we had mid-level bureaucrats within the Department of Justice, or no, within the Department, Office of Civil Rights, within the Department of Education, who then engaged in, an act of extortion of it, because they didn't go through the rulemaking process. They skipped all of this. They simply sent a letter saying, we're going to withhold your funding, unless you create these tribunals that have, if you actually look at the regulations, have a construction of what it means to be guilty of sexual assault or harassment that is so expansive that it actually encompasses, as the law professor Jeannie Gerson put in an essay she wrote about this, it encompasses everything that students are doing today. And so they're creating a situation where no one is actually not guilty. There isn't, there has to, like a system of law only attains the status of law if you can say, if I do ABC and I don't do XYZ, I haven't done anything wrong. And the direction in which the sort of McKinnonite feminism that informs these regulations is to arrive at a point where, as McKinnon wrote, sexual assault is when a woman feels violated, has sex and feels violated, right? It becomes a total subjectivism. And of course, this has a counterpart in the idea that it is impact rather than intent that matters, when it comes to a racial microaggression and so on and so forth. It's another way of subverting, because intent is crucial to the criminal law, right? So we have these ways of undermining the very idea of the rule of law that are being embedded institutionally through new offices, new regulatory offices within the university that are manufactured in response to student protests. And so there's this endless cycle, which it in turn then creates an employment pipeline for those who are graduates of what had once been derided as the grievance studies, grievance studies departments. So on the one hand, it's a kind of moral entrepreneurialism. On the one hand, it's a kind of bureaucratic entrepreneurialism. Yet all of it is premised upon the creation and the identification of great moral emergencies, the ability and willingness to do so in the face of the facts, as with the rape crisis that was manufactured in the face of an 85% in the decrease, right, in the number of rapes in this country. And so how did all this happen, right? It happened because the powers that were originally invested in the federal government in order to dismantle the Jim Crow regime ended up, for a couple of different reasons. One of those reasons being that system was made on behalf of a small minority that was always politically unpopular. Polling on affirmative action has always shown supermajorities of the country opposed to it. It has never shown otherwise, and so it didn't have popular support. So how do you sustain it in the face of it? One of the strategies they ended up doing is they managed to they created new categories of those who would sort of owe fealty to that system through the creation of new categories of the oppressed. And of course there was there's the women's movement, there's the gay rights movement, then the disability movement. And so ideological succession also happens at a point at which you pass a kind of threshold, right? You pass a kind of threshold where most of the things that these movements sought have already been obtained. And so what do you do then, right? You have this enormous, like the LGBTQ movement is it's the best funded, most corporate friendly. It made the most progress in the shortest amount of time. Sort of Andrew Sullivan wrote an essay about gay marriage in 1990, and it was seen as a kind of horizon that was out there that was not really seen as very realistic. And of course the polls, and of course Clinton passed a Defense of Marriage Act, and all the polls showed supermajority opposition to it. And yet by the year 2010 or so, this cultural work had happened, and it was a combination of both sort of cultural and moral exhortation, on behalf of the humanity and the need for inclusion of a group of people. But there was an essay recently that appeared in the New York Times on the basis of a book that looked at the push for gay marriage, that pointed out that cancel culture works, and it was an important part of this because there were organizations and entities that were funding opposition to gay marriage, and those people were exposed in the press, and they were punished for standing in the way of the path of human rights and of inclusion. And as a result, those who supported the push were able to outspend those who opposed it, by something like a factor of 10 to 1. And so we have this machine, right, to create righteous social change. And of course, now that we're on the other side of it, just as we're on the other side of 1865, everyone has coalesced around the view that this was a boon for human flourishing, and we cannot go back. I mean, there are some, there's some dangerous reactionaries out there who have not accepted this, but the overall consensus of the public, and also public opinion, reflects that this machine was able to take something that was opposed by a supermajority and get a supermajority to support it, in part through their control of certain choke points within the cultural apparatus and within the governmental apparatus and within the courts. They made the thing happen. And so, you have a Ferrari. What do you do with it, right? You've attained your goals, though. You've reached your destination. Do you then put it in mothballs? Do you sort of, leave a little garrison to make sure that there's no backsliding? Do you declare victory? Or do you aim it at a new target? In part because you have all of these people whose livelihoods depends upon it. And then do you then manufacture a new distinction, a new class of the oppressed and the new class of the oppressors? The oppressed being the 0.05% of the population that that doesn't feel that their gender identity conforms to their morphological structure, versus the oppressed, the cisgendered, the 99.5% of the country, who, by virtue of their, by exert a kind of force of oppression on those undergoing both the genocide, right, in terms of, speech, but also a trans Black murder crisis, right? And you look at the crisis, you look at the underlying stories, you look at the data under it, something like, 20 people who can be described in these terms, are killed. What's the right baseline? Is it going up or down? Is this a crisis? Is it new? Is it one of the sort of, conditions of life that those who are involved in the sex trade and the drug trade, like all of these questions, of course, are presumptively illegitimate. One cannot ask them. It becomes a part of the new progressive, credo that this is an unquestioned fact. And then so now we see a kind of manufacture of a new set of saints and heroes, such as for example Matthew Shepard. We all know him to be he's recognized. His grave is recognized in Washington, D.C. We all know him to be a great martyr who served as a rallying point in the cause of gay liberation. It turns out, though, you actually look at the story, he was a meth dealer. He was killed by a group of other meth dealers. One of the meth dealers that killed him was a prior gay lover, right? So was this in fact a homophobic act, or was it, or was this an act emerging, from the matrix of an increasingly socially disorganized or white working class in Nebraska, right? Where the pathologies that we had once thought of as belonging to other regions of the country have visited, right? Like, which one of those things was it? And of course, he's now within the pantheon of our saints and martyrs. And so there's a in addition to a definition of keeping out all those things that I listed. We're now in the process of manufacturing, as we cancel, sort of, remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson from New York City, as the San Francisco Board of Education, they voted to remove both Dianne Feinstein and Abe Lincoln, one of those things being more significant than the other, from the names of elementary schools because of their implication in the prior regime. So
we'd start taking questions soon.
Okay.
You said a lot. That's wonderful. And yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of reaction.
Yeah, we already have many questions. And let me just say that that my favorite part of the talk was when you called Harvey Weinstein, which was richly deserved after that terrible attempt at a joke in his introduction. So that was great.
It was totally inadvertent, but yes.
Also, I noticed a little bit of indignation in your remarks. So I take back what I said, that you are totally without it.
I'm not a great public speaker, but like generating it gives me the energy to make it through. So
yes, you are. So we start out with Adam White, please.
Thanks, and thanks, Wesley, for your talk. Your discussion of the educational environment and how the successor ideology has permeated it so quickly made a lot of sense to me. But what I've been fascinated by is how this is played out in the private sector, where obviously the institutions are different, the incentives are different. There's some things in common, both in education on Title IX and also in the private sector. In various areas, you see sort of a burgeoning compliance industry within both, and that creates an interesting dynamic in both. But I'm just curious how you see the successor ideology playing out so far and in the future in the private sector.
So I recently read a book that I'm going to be writing about at my Substack called Race Experts, and it's by a woman named Elizabeth Lash Quinn, who's the daughter of Christopher Lash, and she wrote about the then emerging, I think the book came out in the early 2000s, profession of racial sensitivity training, and it's taken different terms over the time, but she traces its roots to the human potential movement of the 1960s and the encounter groups of the 1970s, and they were all based on this idea that a kind of cathartic unburdening of one's emotions and of one's hidden racism was a path toward racial reconciliation. And she shows that this was manufactured by a bunch of hippie cranks and doesn't have any actual scientific basis. This is something, of course, that we know with respect to all of this training. It's been tested. There have been studies done on it. For the most part, they tend to increase rather than decrease racial tensions, and decrease the willingness, in much the same way that the Me Too movement has done, of white people to serve as mentors or as to talk at all, right, to people who hold a gun to their head at any moment, against which, as a matter of doctrine, right, they're not allowed to defend themselves. The defense itself being, right, like a form of racism. So it is this kind of and she writes about how all of this has a precedent throughout the history of the civil rights movement. You had these white people that were incredibly desperate for the approval of the Black people in movement, and there would be these constant confrontations and struggle sessions where the white people would try to prove themselves as deserving of the respect, or to be one of the good ones, and so on and so forth. And that was a dynamic that was endemic to the movement and became more intense as the kind of early Christian rooted civil rights movement gave way to more militant forms of Black power and so on. If you look at sort of the writings of David Horowitz, who was linked to the radical underground of the time, and who was involved in, it sort of culminated for him in the murder of his of a female friend by what he believes to be some Black Panthers, and sort of that initiated his break from this movement. But ultimately, these dynamics of sort of white guilt, Black rage, Black paranoia, and the rage and the paranoia being sort of irreducibly interlinked with one another, ultimately resulted in a lot of white people giving up, right, after the 60s and the 70s. And so now we're seeing this dynamic that was once kind of a very small scale dynamic among super progressive 1960s radicals, radical whites, being reconstituted, right, like at Goldman Sachs, right, like and for those, and at Google and at Facebook, right. And what we've seen is a few examples of some tech companies where the tensions have been very intense, making a public statement, right? So I don't know if you know about the Coinbase. So Coinbase is like a crypto company, and they put out a statement, hey guys, like, we're here to work. We're a mission-focused organization. Our focus is to be a company, and so our purpose is not to be a signaling device, nor an encounter session. And of course, then there were exposés in the New York Times about various microaggressions and pay disparities that were visible there. They were attacked with full force by the regime, right? And they seem to have survived it. It didn't tank their share price. They did their IPO not long afterwards, and they remain a functional company. What Coinbase did was what many CEOs privately are saying to themselves that they would love to muster the courage to be able to do, but they do face a kind of structural problem. So the New York Times, they just did a story about 37-year-old millennial employees who are now afraid of their 23-year-old Zoomer employees, and the Zoomer employees, will assign work to their bosses, right? And they will preemptively declare that because of menstrual cramps, like, they're not coming into work, and one of the one of the CEOs who was interviewed, wrote a book and gave it to his assistant to do what's called a sensitivity read, to tell him if there's anything problematic within it. And within a day, she handed him back 1,100 comments, right, of areas where he had transgressed in his book. So people who are 23, right, are on the other side of this. And in fact, you do polls, people who are 23 are actually more concerned about and more opposed to this thing called cancel culture than anybody else. Because in many cases, you'll have people who will have 3, 4, 5 friends who have been canceled for various sins. But cancellation, of course, like political correctness, is always a relational term. It always refers to the thing that is a kind that you regard as a kind of excess, right? The thing that is at the baseline, right, is that like when you give me a book to seek something that is problematic, I'm going to find 1,100 things in it, right? On the one hand. So this is like a generational succession as well, right? You have people who don't know any other set of values than the one that I've just, than the ones that I've just articulated. You have people who saw the sign in 2016 in their lunchroom about going to the kitchen staff about fat phobia that they've witnessed, and who didn't laugh at that, right? Who didn't see that as bizarre, who saw that as like, this is like the foundation of this is my moral foundation, right? That fat phobia is also a moral emergency that is ongoing, that is harming people more than obesity is harming them, in much the same way that law enforcement is harming people more than crime is harming them, right? Like two propositions that are held within the kind of, you know, the moral fantasia, right, of the wealthiest, most cosseted people that the world has ever seen.
Wes, I'm sorry, I have to be super rude because we have so many questions, and sometimes I'll cut you off. Is that okay? I don't want to.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, no, do it routinely.
Okay. Susan Shell, and then Manuel Lopez, and then Rita Kugansen. Susan, you have to unmute yourself. Susan, unmute yourself.
I love to unmute myself. Thank you very much. I think you've done, you know, a lot of good, and I think you shed a lot of light, and you have a lot of. I agree entirely with much of your diagnosis, and deplore it. Deplore the kinds of tendencies you're talking about, especially as they affect the university and parts of industry. Although I suspect it's a relatively narrow slice where it really matters. So let me just make 2 points. Firstly, I'm a little uncomfortable with the word succession ideology, because frankly, when I first heard it, I thought it was replacement ideology. I thought you were talking about the Great Replacement. In other words, there's something kind of formal about succession. You know, it doesn't tell you which it is. The Great Replacement is that right-wing ideology about how the whites are being, you know, replaced by people of color and so on. So it's certainly not a self-explanatory expression. So I would just, you know, kind of maybe alert you a little bit to that, but, you know, maybe that will prove to be irrelevant. But the second part is that I don't really think it is a succession ideology, in the sense that, and here I'm going to play devil's advocate. If I were Bernie Sanders' nightmare version of an oligarch, I would love this stuff. I would love it because A, it doesn't raise my taxes. B, I can go along with it and without losing any money. In other words, unlike Marxism, which wanted to, you know, nationalize industry and take people's private property away, if necessarily violently, I don't see any sign yet that this is really, you know, touching the power centers of America in a serious way. Now that may happen, but so far, nobody's going to jail, nobody's being murdered, nobody's losing property. People are losing, you know, I suppose, employment here and there. But isn't this really a kind of, if you were a Marxist of the old school, wouldn't you think this was a really dangerous reassertion of liberal capitalism as opposed to a succession? That is to say, who are the trans people who are most celebrated are often people like Caitlyn Jenner, who's, you know, a very, you know, wealthy, privileged person. In other words, doesn't this whole ideology kind of suck up all the compassion away from the genuinely downtrodden? So that's my question.
You know, that is a critique of it that's made by Adolf Fried, among others, and it comes from, you know, hard Marxists who, to them, it's just completely obvious, right, that this is a way of preventing the, you know, the coalescence of shared interests of people between working class people across racial lines, and I think that's right. I mean, but nonetheless, it is a kind of succession relative to the specific principles that are involved, because it's about the, you know, the using of therapeutic concepts to create a whole new set of regulatory structures, and yes, I think it is. It is part of the status quo. On the other hand, if you listen to the sort of rhetoric of Ibram X. Kendi, he says that, like, you know, you can't be anti-racist without attacking capitalism. But, like, of course, you know, he does this as the, you know, recipient of, you know, the largesse of all the sort of robber baron foundations, right? And of course, so if you were to take a conspiratorial cast of mind, why are the Ford and Mellon and Soros, and why are all these foundations? Because ultimately, this is a creed that is supported by capitalism. It's supported by the large corporations. It's supported by the large foundations, and however, it is. And let's go back to this question of succession, because there is a racial dimension to it. The baby boomers were the whitest, least foreign-born cohort in American history, and the millennials are the you know, the most foreign-born generation in American history, and so people under the age of 18 are majority non-white. And so this has generated, you know, a kind of tension that generated, on the one hand, MAGA ideology, right? This idea that we can restore what demographics has already, you know, shifted. And then on the other hand, the equity ideology, right? Now, the equity ideology, in fact, and this is a point that, you know, I'm going to make in subsequent writings on wesleyyang.substack.com, is in fact, and we saw this in the last election, right? Like, quite hostile to the interests of the new non-white diversity in this country, right? And for the most part is opposed by it. So you just have to look at the you know, the affirmative action, you know, Prop 19 in California. So, you know, back in 1996, at a time when the California was already majority minority, in that whites were fewer than 50% of the population, they still were a majority of the voting electorate because of age effects, and, you know, a lot of the new Californians did not vote, and so they voted to deny certain government benefits to undocumented immigrants, to illegal aliens, as they were called at the time, and also to forbid the use of racial preferences in government contracting and in college admissions. But the idea was, okay, that kind of declining minority that still clung to power and tried to grandfather in its power through, you know, acts of legislative plunder in the 90s, you know, inevitably they're going to be politically, you know, rendered sort of politically weak, and we'll have a new population that will be able to vote back in these things. And 2020 was going to be the year that was going to happen, because, you know, by that point, you know, the state is a plurality Hispanic state. And the reinstitution of affirmative action actually means one large minority, Hispanics, taking away things from another smaller racial minority, Asians, right? Like, in practical terms, that's actually what it means. And that's actually where the interests of the Hispanic plurality that drove their leadership, sort of drove the Prop 16, And of course, the Prop 16 forces, they outspent those who opposed Prop 16 by a factor of 10 to 1, as tends to be the case on these progressive issues that have that reflect elite consensus. And of course, you know, it was defeated by a supermajority, even in this new racially re-engineered or you know, population. And it was supported more, and Asians and Hispanics, both sort of the non-white diversity of that state, opposed Prop 16 at rates higher than white Americans, right? And so, well, we've become majority non-white, it doesn't necessarily mean that the equity agenda is being supported. And why would it not be supported? Between the years 2015 and 2019, the group whose income grew fastest in America were Hispanic Americans. And the group whose income, and so this encompasses many of the Trump years, right? And the group whose income grew second fastest were Asian Americans. So non-white, non-Black diversity has a different set of interests than the one that would be posited by those who say that like a great replacement is going to happen as non-whites sort of agglomerate into a new people of color formation that sort of overawes you know, the white, you know, the dwindling white minority. So it actually turns out to be the case that when you give people a chance to express their preferences in an anonymous poll, America's non-white, non-Black diversity is not aligned with the equity agenda. And so in a way, the kind of the polarization that occurs between sort of MAGA and the equity agenda, they're both, in a sense, trying to control things before America's non-white, non-Black diversity takes the reins or achieves a kind of political maturity. You know, both of these groups are very far from being able to achieve, you know, from having achieved political maturity. But we did see, you know, in the last election, the most Mexican, the most Hispanic, the most Mexican counties in America, right by the Texas border, you know, voted in 2016 for Hillary by, you know, by huge margins. And there was a 40-point move toward Trump in that border town. Because it turned out to be the case, none of us knew this, all one had to do was go and ask them, but no one did. Turned out to be the case that those who are most directly exposed, right, to the difficulties imposed by illegal immigration are more recent immigrants. And you can moralize at them and you can say, you're pulling out the ladder. Actually, they're serving their interests. And so, politics of replacement, right, on the one hand, are a part of it, because there is this idea that like whiteness is this residual, you know, toxic, dangerous force that we now have a political opportunity, you know, to bring to heel. That is at the core of the successor ideology, right? But it turns out to be the case that actual diversity, right, is not conforming, right, to the and so there's this push and pull between the Successor Coalition, right, which are those who sort of, you know, the activist class that, you know, sort of, that is an iron triangle within the Democratic Party. There is this new kind of successor theology that is embedded within the party. The party knows that it's a kind of electoral liability. You have these debates on Twitter between David Shor, Matt Iglesias, and those who say that, you know, popularism, you know, say that we have to like not focus on these really unpopular boutique, you know, elite causes of the radically less disciplinary society of the street and the radically more disciplinary society of the boardroom and workplace. And I agree with you that it is not a revolutionary creed. I agree with you that it does not threaten capitalism, but I also see that the ideology is beginning to create a merger between corporations that are seeking within it, having consumerism take on an aspect of moral compulsion, right, on the one hand, because like what consumer entity would not want to have that in its favor? And then on the other hand, the national security state, right, as a new, vocabulary through which, it can express its new moral mandate. And of course, we see this kind of otherizing dynamic where we're saying, well, the new country, in order to be born, must bring, the toxic whites, the Trump revanchists, the MAGA to heel. There has to actually be a kind of literal, or metaphorical domestic war on terror, right, to bring this to heel, because Trump then was the figure who ended up sort of fulfilling what most of us would have recognized as being the fantasies of the Successor Coalition about he sort of dramatized, this vision of, oh, the oppression is real, the nightmare is back, the progress.
You're really, really hard to cut off because you don't make any pauses. I have to be a bitch. Okay, Rita, you go next.
Okay, well, I think I've sort of lost the thread of my question at this point, because you've sort of started to answer it in your responses to Susan. But my question was, I mean, you said in your remarks that, this is a tiny minority of oppressed people who are being sort of lifted up by the successor ideology. And I wonder if that's really true, or if that's really the strategy that's being deployed here. Because isn't part of what the successor ideology does is to radically expand the number and kinds of people who would fall under this umbrella of oppression. So like, for example, the move from the category of Black or African American to person of color, which includes an ambiguous number of other groups who are now vying to be included in this desirable category, right? So you have this whole debate, like, are Jews persons of color? Right. And the goal of most of the people arguing for this is like, yes, we should be included as persons of color because benefits will accrue to us if we could be so included. Or, the move from gay and lesbian, these sort of discrete narrow categories, to queer, which is another ambiguous evolving category that then brings in a whole lot of people who would not otherwise identify as either gay or lesbian, or maybe bisexual, another category that predated this, right? But queer is really big. And don't you get at some point to a point in which you have a near majority or even a majority of Americans who are, understanding their self-identity or their identity category in one of these categories of oppression, which would seem to be, something that you would need in a democracy. Ultimately, you need to generate a majority somehow. And doesn't this ultimately create a kind of expanding category that ends up looking like a majority?
Yeah, well, so when I spoke of tiny minority, I was referring to the trans person, but it's so interesting because they showed that you really can sort of manufacture out of almost nothing a society-wide, right, something that would encompass, our fundamental understanding of biology, right? Like, and so it is the ne plus ultra, right? In many different respects, but there will be more to come, right? Because you now have members of Democratic Socialists of America who put their handicaps, self-diagnosed Asperger's, into their bios, into their Twitter bios as a way of sort of, well, I'm not just a white person, right? I'm not just a white man. And so you have this category of those who identify as queer, who will only date, right? Like upper middle class, right? Like white, nubile women, right? But they're queer, right? As a matter of identification. And so like California, they recently said that like they mandated that corporate boards, right, have to have like a certain quantum of either racial diversity or sexual identitarian status. And of course, this means there's going to be a massive expansion of bisexuals, right, or otherwise, kink identifying categories. And so in terms of the majority minority, Shep Melnick's book about Title IX, he points out that you go through the statutes, right? There are an absolute majority of people who qualify as some kind of protected class. So that has already been done. But the succession happens, I think, when people the succession happens at the point at which people cease cynically exploiting these identifications and begin sincerely rooting their self-understanding within them. And I think that is happening. So, back in 2014, the percentage of people at Pomona College, one of the most expensive liberal arts country in the country, who identified as disabled was 5%. By 2019, the figure had grown to 23%. Now, on the one hand, this is about people cynically, exploitatively using their parents' money to get more time on tests or seek, illegitimate advantages on everybody else by identifying themselves as disabled. But I think the more troubling thought, actually, is that they have embedded and taken on board what was once a cynical ploy and now conceive of themselves, as in fact disabled. Because it turns out to be the case that people don't like to think of themselves as liars and hypocrites. And in the act of being a liar and a hypocrite, they will often persuade themselves of the reality of the thing. And their whole sort of like emotional map will have been rewritten. And I think as a culture as a whole, I think we're at like a kind of 1/5 of our way into this process. It's already insane, but God knows what will happen when we get to 2/5 of our way into that process. 2/5 of our way into the process means a kind of total moral and spiritual inundation, right, of the culture as a whole, or possibly just of its elites, right? So, I did a thread about the last Princeton University class. They announced their admitted class was 68% people of color, right? And on the one hand, this means that in this context, we're going to count the Asian American as a person of color, even though in other contexts, when it comes to affirmative action and so on, they are excluded from that. But it also means, those that have, an Italian grandparent who did a stopover in Argentina, right, like prior to moving to the United States, is now a Hispanic. If they happen to bear, a name like Iglesias, and Iglesias often sort of jokes about this. He's like, well, I'm a white dude, but like, the name did a certain work on my behalf. Yes, that is, and so the thread ended up sort of making this argument that this is how we're going to solve the whiteness is toxicity problem, at least for those members of the elite who are clued into the nature of this game, which is we make it a toxic identification that is seen as inherently complicit with genocide, okay, but we allow you to identify out of it. And so that movement, and so formally, and those who are sort of not clued into this, who are not sort of emotionally, psychologically, politically labile enough, well, who are those people going to be, right? Those are going to be the evil whites, the ones who must be surveilled, whose speech must be prevented from spreading misinformation, lies about the election, for whom a domestic war on terror has to be launched, right? And then you have these other people who are non-whites at the top, despite looking not so different, right, than anyone else, because it's a matter of, so, Nikki Hannah-Jones put the term politically black into circulation. So now we're being ever more explicit about the nexus between race and identification. So the politically white, right, is the backward one who didn't know to say in response, well, in fact, I have an Armenian, right, like a great grandfather, and so this means that I'm a Near Eastern non-white person. And of course, there will be energy, to change the taxonomy, to recognize new forms of defection from whiteness, which will itself be a form of privilege, sort of leaving behind a rump.
Thank you, Manuel.
I was wondering, I know you've written and spoken about Asian values specifically separately, and I was wondering if you could bring this to bear on this question of the succession ideology in this sense. So I wonder if there is a greater chance for something successful, at least in a political worldly sense, being successful with particularly Asian values or particular ideological developments in China. And what I mean by that is, for one thing you've said, I know, in emphasizing Asian values, is a combination of filial piety, grade grubbing, middle-class servility, deference to authority. And then I wonder, in China in particular, a kind of open rejection, I think, of democracy in many ways, explicit open embrace of despotism. There's a famous writer, top of the New York Times bestseller list, Cixin Liu, who has said point blank that democracy is not appropriate for China, and individual liberty and freedom is just not what the Chinese people want. So there's openness about that, but at the same time combine this combination of some things that are certainly left-wing, but with some things that are right-wing, i.e. Ethnocentrism, nationalism, the pro-family aspect, and obviously respect for authority, and somehow when you throw into that despotism, it seems to be something to make the left more manageable on a large scale, to manage a large group of people. So I was just wondering if you had some thoughts of whether that Asian genius for despotism, in the words of Montesquieu, Tocqueville, among others, doesn't provide some guidance and perhaps give a different vision of how this turns out than what we're seeing now in the West.
Right. So you definitely have some Xi Jinping curious, hard right reactionaries in the U.S. because among the other things that he's doing, he sort of installed a hard cap on the amount of video games that you could play and banned effeminate movie, TV, and music stars in attempt to. So this is one of those things where it's kind of like, well, they did the one-child policy. This is something that is totally inconceivable within the framework of a liberal society within a Western society. And an argument that Francis Fukuyama threw out about biotechnology was that because they are not Christian, they don't have this idea of a soul that is sort of distinct from the body. That's one of the reasons they were able to meddle in the reproductive function in a way that would be inconceivable here. And it's one of the reasons why they're going to be able to genetically engineer, right, like a race of supermen, right, in a way that Christian pro-life sentiments and so on serves as a check on over here. On the other hand, without there being any consciousness, just through a spontaneous private sector driven process, we've pretty much kind of, through testing and selective abortion, right, pretty much gotten Down syndrome, right, except among those who are, heavily pro-life, in their religious commitments. So we've gone through a same kind of technologically mediated eugenic process. So, look, I mean, China now is in the process of constructing a kind of terminal totalitarianism, and to kind of recapitulate something that kind of Yuval Noah Harari speculates about. He's like, look, maybe the free market was a better information processor before big data existed, right? Like maybe the ability to consolidate all knowledge about all transactions and about local conditions in one place means that we have undergone a kind of technological change where the advantages of a free society and free exchange can be superseded. And Chinese are just going ahead and doing that. and on the other hand, like we are now in the process of constructing a very partisan, right? A very partisan social credit system of our own, right? And of course, it's being used in emergency circumstances on behalf of, to suppress like actual bad people, actual intriguers against the election. But we also see plenty of room, and we also see the will on behalf of those in a position to do this, to extend, right, the scope through which we demand private corporations censor, surveil, integrate themselves within the security services in pursuit of, a war against misinformation, hate, harassment, and so on, that can serve as the basis of its own, right, terminal totalitarianism. And so, like in a privatized sense, we're moving in a very similar direction, and we're moving in a direction not through kind of state-centric means, but through party-centric means. But we're doing it for the same reason. It's because like technology makes it possible. So there may just be a kind of like convergence around those things that happens naturally. I'm very interested in seeing if China can make its young men more manly than they would otherwise be. I'm also interested in what the enduring effects of a one-child policy are going to be. Sort of an argument that sort of I've tweeted out on a couple of times is that there's a certain variation of personality types that a large family will generate, right? Like a super responsible eldest son, or a child that is that is largely shielded from parental authority and raised by their siblings, produces like personality types that were constitutive of the world as we knew it. And, China engaged in a process of raising that whole seedbed of that kind of diversity of personality, so that they have only children, right? And all that entails. This is a nation of only children. And so is a nation of only children truly going to hold at bay the individualism, right? And rights-based thinking, right? That it is alleged, the sort of East Asian cultural legacy is going to hold at bay. I don't think that it will, and I think that, sort of the reason why Xi is trying to hold back the floodgates of individualism, consumerism, and the effeminacy and the breakdown of the family that sort of he diagnoses as following behind the adoption of those values. He's, is he going to be successful, or is he, a boy with his finger in the dike, despite having the power of the Chinese state behind him? I don't know, but it's a very interesting thing that I'm going to want to learn more about. And you definitely see, I don't know if any of you have read Darren Beattie, but he's like this, problematic MAGAist figure, but he represents the kind of China curious reactionary right, and has put it in essays, sort of describing the kind of cultural decline and decay, that they see as linked to the successor ideology. I see the successor ideology more as like here we have this kind of bourgeois moral revolution that mostly affects the bourgeoisie. However, there has been this kind of overreaching where you have trained a cadre of teachers that are out there, and it's producing democratic contestation, and it may actually flip the Virginia governorship. It's all going to play out, so the people, for the most part, tend not to have a say in the governance and regulation of elite institutions and spaces. But when you exist in such an echo chamber that you think that you can teach white toxicity, cis heteropatriarchy to not just the average white man, but to the average child of a Black or Hispanic, immigrant or worker in California, you may discover that they're in fact, electoral politics is going to kick in, and you may have, in the process of indulging your echo chamber sensibility, have lost your mandate to rule. We're going to see how this all works out. I'm very interested to see how.
No, let me ask a question, because I have one that consolidates several questions that we've had in chat. Okay, well.
Yeah, I have a last question. What about the role of feminism in the successor ideology? You haven't really spoken of that, but I'm thinking of the idea of raising consciousness, the focus on language, pronouns, and so on, the use of personal attacks, as with Me Too, and above all, reliance on shame instead of violence.
So it's absolutely essential, and of course, it's part of the Title IX thing that I was talking about. And it's also, so there's, on the one hand, there's feminism, right, like an organized movement, and then there's also feminization, right? There's about the kind of the introduction of specifically feminine standards of conduct and of judgment and of styles of leadership and approaches and of concerns, different levels of risk tolerance, right? Like women tend to be much more concerned about toxins in the air. If you look at, you look at the data that, that reflect, imperatives that are at the core of gender difference, right? And so the kind of the absolute lockdown in New Zealand and so on, like just different ideas, different attitudes towards the role of government, and different kinds of headlines and reporting that we get. Sort of Michelle Goldberg wrote this piece about like democracy grief is real, and she talks about being at her therapist, and she talks about women whose lives are just consumed by pervasive terror through the Trump years. And that's all fine, but it's a new thing. It's a new way of talking about public affairs, and it happened. There was a kind of boiling of a frog that people started to notice toward the end of the second decade of the 21st century. That there's a whole kind of tone of our public life had altered. So there was a piece about sexism at Apple, at Mike, that I often cite, and they sort of, it was a breathless expose, and the cardinal example that they presented was, there was an email chat room, and the men were joking about rape, right? And so, but like it turned out to be the case that what they were referring to was somebody sharing this thing from back in 2015 called the Bed Intruder Song, which is where there's this kind of like viral video, which was the most popular viral video of its time, where you had somebody auto-tuned this like this Southern Black guy talking about an incident where somebody intruded into his sister's bedroom, and it was the most popular viral comedic video of the time. Were they sort of literally construed joking about rape? In some sense, yes, but in another sense, are we allowed to share the, the #1 most popular viral comedic video of the time, or are we not? And of course, this did not produce, at the time, this is 2015, this is still early on in this process, this did not produce a kind of bloodletting and, inquisition within Apple, because people still recognize that, like, we're going to have to hold in balance the fact that, like, there are differing risk sensitivity levels, and it can't always be the case that the most sensitive person always prevails in setting the normative standard upon which everybody has to obey, right? But there is this kind of harm-based, tort-based conception of things that makes it very hard to do that, right? Because you have this kind of intangible thing, which is like our ability to have bonhomie, to joke around, to enjoy ourselves with our colleagues, which is like an intangible thing, weighed against this person experiencing literal harm, literal violence. I was shaking, and so, like, how do you moderate between those things? And how do you moderate between those things when, as a general rule, and of course, there are women who, love to get body, and, but on the whole, right, there's going to be the baseline is going to be different for these two groups. So how do they work together? And how do they work together and cooperate, given the fact that one standard that is appropriate for one part of this cohort is going to be seen as hate, harassment, and violence by another part of the cohort, and where what is seen as, and even just to take, like, well, how do you regulate the temperature, right? Because, like, men and women have, like, on average, different temperature preferences, and then so you see these articles about how, like, the temperature is one of the instruments through which masculinity is enforced in these offices, and there's no easy answer, but the answer cannot be anyone who claims harm always prevails. And the problem is that there's this disciplinary apparatus that now exists, and in order to have something to do, in order to justify the fact that their salaries, right, inevitably are always incentivized to move inexorably toward whoever claims harm, by virtue of the fact that they claim harm, right, like, has won. And so now it just produces this, like, specific problem. Janet Halley wrote an essay where she talks about moving from the gavel to from the megaphone to the gavel. She's saying that, like, feminists are now in power, right? And she goes on to sort of show various examples of this, and feminists who are in power cannot retain the attitude of activists while being in power, because when you retain this sensibility of great moral emergencies, of harm, of violence, of terror that must be preemptive through immediate action, and there is no balancing test that has to be done, and you have power, because we can say, well, it's part of the healthy system that you do have these people that are always pushing us to get better, and that's what the sort of patrician leader says, I want you to be out there pushing me to be better. But when those people are actually the ones that are in power, and they retain this sensibility of, oh, there's always this great moral emergency, and we can't, and we can't have a balancing test, then we get into a situation where inevitably there cannot be coexistence. And of course, this is the whole kind of Me Too thing, right? Like, there has to be a clear set of standards where if I do X, Y, Z, and ABC, and I don't do X, Y, and ABC, I haven't done anything wrong, and we all agree that that's the case. It can't be the case that in order for you to feel safe, you have to be able to determine what is reality simply on the basis of your own subjectivity, and that constituted power has to recognize that subjectivity as dispositive of the question in itself. And that is, in fact, what those who are in power that retain the activist sensibility have done in this case, and who managed to impose it on nearly every university in the country, and who are now moving to go beyond and embed this within the criminal law itself. And so like in New York State, Andrew Cuomo in 2019 signed into law an act of the legislature that removed the reasonability requirement for actions on behalf of sexual harassment. They removed the reasonability requirement, meaning that you no longer had to prove that there was any reasonable basis for your claim. And of course, you know, I mean, obviously there is an irony there that he fell victim to it. He ultimately fell victim to the politics rather than the law, although at some point it seems like he's going to have to face up to the law, and he's going to find himself unable to say that this claim of subjective harm that is being made against me is unreasonable, and he's going to remember by whose hand, you know, that legislative act was done.
Right.
Thank you. If you want to take one more question, I'll try and consolidate a few things from chat that we haven't done. I think one basic question that kept popping up in chat is, again, the psychological motivations of people, maybe different groups of people. Some say, Tom asks, is this just a quest for meaning? Another person asked, are people really true believers, or is this more misplaced compassion of the stronger on behalf of the ones they perceive as weaker? We know that, you know, there's younger people shoving out older peoples in the struggle for not just recognition, but also simply jobs. So there's opportunism. We know at Harvard, you know, a lot of people say there's conformity or cowardice. People don't speak up because you've talked about this. The subjective gain you can have for intervening is always greater than, the loss that you have is always greater than what little gain you might have. Maybe not in the Trent Colbert case, but so I think could you in a somewhat systematic way hierarchize different motivations for different maybe types of people, and give us your idea.
I think obviously it's a mixture, and it depends from individual to individual. But what is really dispositive is that all of these critiques of gender binary, of whiteness, that, you know, they were around back in the 90s, right? But they were a discursive phenomenon, and they didn't have the power to purge. Right, and now they have that power, and so what is the difference between now and then? You know, and the difference between now and then is there was this process of institutional embedding. You know, there were demands for new classes of administrators to be conjured into existence, and those demands were obtained through student protests. But also just through, you know, bureaucratic politics and infighting, and a kind of general kind of progressive, you know, seizure of power away from the faculty toward the administration. So, you know, there's all this, you know, I don't have a systematic account of the kind of neoliberalizing at the university and how it, you know, all fed into this. But like, you know, that's all part of it. But what eventually happened was we created a cadre of professional activists and activist professionals, right? Who sort of kind of work in loose coordination, you know, through the medium of social media, and they are the Successor Coalition. They are the activist class. They are the people whose power in society and whose jobs in society and whose sinecures all depend upon the advancing of, they have a class interest in the advancing of the regulatory powers and in the kind of power of moral suasion. And so there was also a dynamic where you had a group of people in leadership who had post-1960s egalitarian ideas and sensibilities, and but who nonetheless, you know, still thought that they were in a position to assign work rather than to have work assigned to them by their interns. But who, it's not just cowardice, although it is cowardice, but there's the force behind that cowardice. It's the fear behind the cowardice. Why does the person in charge, nominally in charge, say, hey, this is for you, right? This is for you to do. So after in the wake of there was a kind of racial meltdown at the Condé Nast magazine Bon Appetit. And then there was an expose in the New York Times about racism. And of course, they interview everybody. They get the most shocking, revealing anecdote they can come up with. And that's the thing they print, right? And what did they print? They printed, the editor of one of these magazines gave a copy of E.B. Strunk and White's The Elements of Style to his 22-year-old Black assistant. And that was interpreted by her as a racial microaggression, right? Like A, everybody gets Strunk and White. B, your boss is allowed to tell you you have to improve if you have to improve, if that is in fact what he was saying through that act. But he denies that was he was doing. It's just like a gift that you give to she quit that day. And then she spoke to the Times about how she'd been racially microaggressed, in part because why? Because she had been trained to see it that way, and she really saw it that way, okay? And now it's in the New York Times, and of course it serves this kind of dual purpose. On the one hand, it's like it was framed as racially problematic, and so people who don't read the details are kind of like, ooh, Condé Nast racially problematic, and Condé Nast is not racially problematic, all right? And it's like abuse of the interns, right? And the classism and the abuse, it was all part of it, right? I mean, and it's what drove sort of the plot of The Devil Called Prada, all this stuff. But it's like, why then does someone fear to be like, that's your job? Because the reasonability requirement has been stripped out by the culture. So there's a reason, okay? Because he doesn't want to end up in the New York Times. He did end up in the New York Times in a different way, right? Sort of presenting the anecdote on his own terms, like, haha, my intern assigned me work. And it is funny, but it's also not funny. If you actually care about the functioning of institutions and organizations, it's not going to work that way. And it's well, is this consistent with capitalism? And yes, on the one hand, yes, it's because these people, they're not bearing pitchforks and they're not going to expropriate you. On the other hand, is it consistent with the operations of capitalism? And the wrong kind of no, right? It's not going to work if everybody believes that they can assign jobs to their bosses. And if they believe, rightly so, that all they have to do is go on Twitter to bring about their ruin, right? So, you have a handful of people that are sufficiently grandfathered in so that they can survive these things. They can survive their email being posted online, full of, framed as being full of, racism and so on. But you have a lot of other people who are not grandfathered in, and you have a lot of other people who, there just have been too many examples of, there was the story about the Away executive, right, who basically was presented, she wanted the people to work. she was not shy about saying it, and then she had to resign as a result of the revelation, right, of the fact that she wanted her subordinates to work, right? And so there's this kind of new and of course in the end this is about the therapeutic apparatus state mentality that we all thought was going to lead to a kind of happy barbarism and moral relativism and banality, actually turning into a kind of intense moral absolutism on behalf of subjectivism, on behalf of conscripting others into my moralistic fantasies, my fantasies about my identity, right? As a moral matter, others must participate, and those who do not participate are enacting violence, right? So, you know, can we reach an equilibrium where the world will continue as before while we live in a world of pervasive cringe where we have to tiptoe around our employees? Maybe yes. Maybe that will never result in a kind of overall breakdown. You know, there was a book called Disabling Society that was about the kind of the harms that a kind of an overweening civil rights state was responsible for. And he says it doesn't have to take the form of an overall breakdown, but it can take the form. And he was talking about how disability regulations and so on, and it can progressively over time sap the energy, competence, and will of a society in ways that will only manifest at a point where it's too late. And, you know, so there's this question, you know, is the Afghanistan withdrawal one of those moments where suddenly the termites gnawing away at the structure of American competence become visible? I don't know. I don't know enough about it, but certainly it was a claim that was made by people on the right wing. Will we be able to diagnose it when it comes? Will we be forbidden from making that diagnosis when it comes, right? And when we make the diagnosis, will we be forbidden from taking any remedial action to reverse it because the momentum behind it and the policing around it is so intense? I don't know the answer to that, but I have a feeling that the answer might be yes. And if the answer ends up being no, I also think, and this is something I'll get into later on the Substack, you know, Asian Americans may have a role to play in all of this because they're playing a role right now in a lot of tech companies, because there is a dynamic that I've spoken to people about where you do have incompetence that are being foisted upon everybody else that certain people have to make up for. And those workhorses that are doing the making up for it's a lot of Asian Americans. All right. And they know that they can't speak up and they're not speaking up and they're not going to speak up, but like they're doing the work. And to the extent that this ever takes the form of a crisis, they may actually have to like muster the wherewithal to like lead. Right. And so for me, that's the kind of like remote horizon. But when I think about my role as an intellectual, it's kind of like, I'm going to like leave a placeholder here where you're going to be able to think about these processes that are ongoing before you and think about like, okay, like we don't have leaders. All we have are these like astroturfed, right, sort of nonprofit, you know, parasites whose only job is to stab Asian Americans in the back. And you know, I'm just a guy on Substack. I'm not a part of anything institutional, but I'm going to leave space for us to think and to know what is true and not be totally brainwashed, you know, by this regime. And maybe at some point, you know, we'll be able to translate the competence that exists within this community into something like a leadership role that will serve everybody's interest in the society. That's how I see my project.
I think your talk makes a good point that crisis is here in many ways, at least in academia, replication crisis. I don't know, in many ways. Chris, Nathan, you may ask a question. This is one of your Substackers, Wes. Unmute yourself, Chris. Chris, you need to unmute yourself. You're still, we can't hear you. Try it.
Chris has been writing some good comments on our open thread. Yeah.
I know, that's okay. Well, let me see if I find an earlier one of yours. I think we can ask. Do you want me to read your Nassim Taleb question, Chris? So the intolerant minority, the presumption is that the liberal majority can tolerate the inconvenience of a little illiberalism, but explicit race consciousness is not a little illiberalism. The comparison to drinking kosher juice seems wildly inconsistent. Where are the adults? Is it possible that they will speak up when liberalism itself insists on its legitimacy in the terms that postmodernism uses? Might, for example, colorblindness find its voice again? This combines with a question earlier, either Chris's or another guys that said, isn't this showing the very inconsistency in liberalism itself, that it ends up elevating tolerance as a value and without being able to defend it against the intolerant? Old question. So you can use this and sum up everything, say everything you still want to say, and this will be your last comment.
Okay. Well, it's a tough question, but I made prior reference to the fact that like the free speech regime was based upon a kind of McCarthyite, HUAC, exclusion, like of those who would have, attacked and undermined the very possibility of the free speech regime, right? And then communists themselves ended up being reintegrated into that free speech regime, those who were able. But on the other hand, of course, it meant that like communists didn't win, right? And so communists like who want to win are like, hey, wait a second, like Noam Chomsky got to like, write a lot of stuff and whatever, be this admired figure in the culture, but like, he was boxed out of, political power his whole life, and his belief that like, oh, we have to continue to adhere to these ideas, just has been falsified. Like, look at how much power we've been able to attain by breaking from it in just the last few years. And so this raises the question of, are these ideas of the Successor Coalition, are they consistent with the maintenance of anything we recognize as liberal? And does the defense of them mean that it is necessary to break from our fetishistic attachment to those values when in fact they are being mortally endangered by those who take up a larger and larger share within the institutions with greater and greater regulatory power? I don't know, it's not up to me to answer that. But I think there are some on the newly reactionary right who have taken the plunge, and we'll see whether or not they get any whether they get any purchase politically, and whether we will rue the day that was allowed to happen. But I'll just say that is the problematic that we are now facing, that there are those who are not merely sort of deviating from or improperly schooled into the kind of undergirding liberal metadiscursive values that were foundational to the world that we all knew, the world of the before times, the world of before 2015 or so. They're not just, they're a whole other thing. And they're a whole other thing that emerged from out of liberalism and that is now seeking to cannibalize liberalism from within, and that is uniquely well positioned to cannibalize liberalism from within in a way that like merely holding the office of the presidency clearly, does not position you to do that. It's as a mid-level figure within the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education, where you actually have power to institute sweeping change across the whole nation. And unless you have a very attentive president who, who actually knows how these things work, okay, so like, Donald Trump learned what critical race theory is by watching the Tucker Carlson show maybe a month before he left office, okay, and then it came up with these executive orders that were instantly reversed on day one, of Biden's entry into office. It's turning into a larger, concerted, house to house fighting in front of, various school boards and so on, that for a while attracted the interest of the Department of Justice and the designation of some of these people as, requiring the scrutiny of the FBI, right, as part of this continuing domestic war on terror that is, on the one hand, is kind of kind of partisan reality television that's ongoing. On the other hand, it's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the former director of the CIA that are engaged in this bizarre reality television show. And so it's genuinely frightening. One derives some comfort from the fact that, there actually isn't an enemy. Yeah. In the same way that, for the most part, okay, there was an Islamist enemy, but there wasn't really an enemy. And so a war on terror against a non-existent enemy can really only go so far, right? But the kind of emotional and verbal incontinence that one had associated with personality disordered people on Twitter is now being adopted by the former head of the CIA, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That in itself is an extremely, bizarre and disturbing fact. The hope is that, the country and its economy and its free enterprise system will continue to operate in spite of the fact that the paranoid and histrionic style of discourse is being adopted by the people that are supposed to be there for their professionalism, sobriety, and judgment, including because it isn't just professors at Yale who are indulging in this language of literal white supremacists in the White House, but the Speaker of the House and so on. And it's kind of like, I don't know how I got to this point or how it relates to the original question. Can you remind me what the question was?
The question was about the very weakness within liberalism itself that leads to its inability to defend itself. That was the original question, but you're on a roll. Yeah. So you can also.
Okay, so this all pertains to I think this is all a manifestation of the weakness, right? Because all you needed was a meme war, a war of an unconstrained, war of ideas on social media to get the people whose job is supposed to be sobriety, professional judgments in the face of adversity, to just become wine moms, right? While occupying, important offices of the national security state, right? And so there is where I would say the breakdown of the proteins, fibers, and tissues, right? That are an assurance of American competence and reliability is manifesting, right? There is this clear there is this clear emotional contagion, and okay, it's going to affect, it's going to afflict, your community, your far left community college employee, in a red state. Yes, they're going to be signaling this nonsense on Twitter, but why has it crossed over, right, to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? So that's the problem. And that shows that the fragility is greater than one would hope, and far greater than probably any of us thought was possible not so long ago.
Well, thanks very much, Wesley. This has been quite wonderful. What we've seen is insight after insight and a certain relentless eloquence and lots of intelligence. So thanks very much for this.